The red recording light on Agent Martinez's phone cast an eerie glow across the mahogany conference table as Marcus Chen watched his entire world collapse through a single audio file. The voice emanating from the device was unmistakably his brother Daniel's, casual and confident as he discussed funneling $2.7 million from Chen Technologies into offshore accounts. What made Marcus's blood freeze wasn't just the theft, it was Daniel's casual laughter as he described manipulating their bedridden father's medication schedule to ensure he remained unconscious during crucial board meetings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The FBI had been investigating a complex money laundering scheme involving tech companies across the Pacific Northwest when they stumbled upon Chen Technologies. What they found was far more personal and devastating than corporate fraud. It was a brother systematically destroying everything their immigrant parents had built, one forged signature and falsified document at a time. Marcus Chen had always believed that blood ran thicker than corporate politics, that family meant something more than quarterly profits and market share. At 34, he had spent the better part of a decade building Chen Technologies from a small software development firm in Seattle into a regional powerhouse specializing in cybersecurity solutions for healthcare systems. The irony wasn't lost on him now, sitting across from federal agents who had just played him audio evidence of his own brother's betrayal. The company had started in their parents' garage in Bellevue, with their father David working 16-hour shifts at Boeing, while their mother Linda cleaned office buildings at night to fund their son's computer equipment. Marcus still remembered the smell of soldering irons mixing with his mother's jasmine tea as he and Daniel wrote their first commercial software program on a secondhand machine their father had bought from a pawn shop. Those early days had been magical in their simplicity. Daniel, 3 years younger but equally passionate about technology, had possessed an intuitive understanding of user interfaces that perfectly complemented Marcus's talent for back-end architecture. They had dreamed of building something that would honor their parents' sacrifice while establishing their own American success story. By 2019, Chen Technologies employed 47 people across 2 offices and had secured contracts with major hospital systems throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Their cybersecurity suite had prevented dozens of ransomware attacks, protecting patient data and saving healthcare providers millions in potential damages. Marcus had genuinely believed they were making a difference while building something meaningful. The first crack in this foundation had appeared 18 months ago when their father suffered a massive heart attack during what should have been a routine board meeting. David Chen had always been the steady presence guiding the company's ethical direction, the immigrant who never forgot where he came from or what he owed to the country that had given his family opportunities. His sudden hospitalization had left a leadership vacuum that Marcus had reluctantly filled while trying to manage both the technical and administrative sides of their expanding business. Daniel had stepped up as well, taking over client relations and business development with an enthusiasm that had initially relieved Marcus. His younger brother had always been the more charismatic of the two, able to charm potential clients and navigate social situations that made Marcus uncomfortable. Having Daniel handle the external relations while Marcus focused on product development and company operations had seemed like a natural division of labor. What Marcus hadn't realized was that Daniel's newfound enthusiasm stemmed not from devotion to the family business, but from recognition of opportunity. With their father unconscious in intensive care and their mother spending every waking moment at his bedside, Daniel had identified the perfect conditions for implementing a plan he had apparently been developing for months. The scheme, as Agent Martinez explained it, was both sophisticated and brazenly simple. Daniel had established a network of shell companies across 3 states, each one designed to appear as a legitimate vendor or subcontractor for Chen Technologies. Through carefully crafted invoices for non-existent services and phantom consulting fees, he had been systematically draining the company's accounts while creating a paper trail that implicated Marcus as an accomplice.
The genius of Daniel's approach lay in his understanding of how Marcus operated. As the technical founder, Marcus had always trusted Daniel to handle the business relationships and vendor management. When invoices arrived from companies claiming to provide marketing services, legal consultation, or business development support, Marcus had approved the payments without extensive investigation, trusting his brother's judgment and expertise. Daniel had exploited this trust methodically, creating fake companies with names similar to legitimate vendors they actually used. Pacific Northwest Consulting became Pacific NW Advisory. Cascade Legal Services became Cascade Business Solutions. Each fraudulent entity maintained professional websites, official letterhead, and even fake employee directories that would pass casual inspection. The FBI's investigation had begun when Homeland Security noticed unusual patterns in currency exchanges involving several tech companies in the Seattle area. Daniel's offshore transfers had triggered automated monitoring systems designed to detect money laundering, but the amounts and frequency had been carefully calibrated to avoid immediate red flags. It was only when investigators began cross-referencing company ownership records that Chen Technologies appeared on their radar. Agent Martinez had spent 6 weeks conducting surveillance before approaching Marcus. During that time, they had documented Daniel's regular visits to a cryptocurrency exchange in Vancouver, his meetings with individuals connected to known money laundering operations, and, most damaging of all, his recorded conversations detailing exactly how he was manipulating both the company and his own family.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The recording that had shattered Marcus's world had been captured during a meeting between Daniel and a suspected money launderer named Viktor Petrov at a downtown Seattle restaurant. Daniel's voice had been clear and confident as he explained how he was using his father's medical condition to maintain control over company finances, while positioning his brother to take the fall if the scheme was discovered. Marcus had listened to his brother describe him as too trusting and technically minded to understand complex financial arrangements, someone who would sign documents without reading them carefully if Daniel presented them as routine business matters. The casual contempt in Daniel's voice had been perhaps more painful than the theft itself. But the recording that had truly destroyed Marcus's world had been captured during a meeting between Daniel and a suspected money launderer named Viktor Petrov at a downtown Seattle restaurant. Daniel's voice had been clear and confident as he explained how he was using his father's medical condition to maintain control over company finances, while positioning his brother to take the fall if the scheme was discovered. Marcus had listened to his brother describe him as too trusting and technically minded to understand complex financial arrangements, someone who would sign documents without reading them carefully if Daniel presented them as routine business matters. The casual contempt in Daniel's voice had been perhaps more painful than the theft itself. But the recording that had truly destroyed Marcus's faith in his brother came next. Daniel had laughed as he told Petrov about adjusting their father's medication schedule to ensure he remained heavily sedated during board meetings where critical financial decisions were being made. He had been collaborating with a corrupt orderly at the rehabilitation facility to administer additional pain medication that would keep David Chen unconscious during visits from the company's accountant and legal counsel. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic elder abuse alongside the financial crimes. Daniel had been forging his father's signature on documents while the older man was drugged into unconsciousness, creating authorizations for wire transfers and account changes that would have been impossible to obtain from a conscious and competent David Chen. As Agent Martinez had explained the scope of the investigation, Marcus had felt his understanding of his brother dissolve completely. This wasn't a desperate mistake or momentary lapse in judgment. Daniel had been planning this betrayal for over a year, carefully positioning himself to steal not just money, but the entire company their parents had sacrificed everything to help them build. The shell companies Daniel had created weren't just vehicles for theft, they were the foundation for a complete corporate takeover.
His plan involved bankrupting Chen Technologies through fraudulent expenses, while positioning himself as the responsible party trying to save the company from his brother's financial mismanagement. Once the company was sufficiently weakened, Daniel's shell companies would emerge as potential investors or acquirers, allowing him to purchase the business at a fraction of its actual value using money he had already stolen from it. The sophistication of the scheme had impressed even the FBI agents investigating it. Daniel had created fake employee records for his shell companies, established credit histories for his fictional entities, and even generated years of backdated financial statements that would survive casual auditing. He had been preparing for this theft since shortly after their father's heart attack, viewing his family's crisis as a business opportunity. Marcus had spent the days following the FBI's revelation in a state of emotional paralysis, unable to process the magnitude of his brother's betrayal. The man who had been his closest collaborator, his trusted business partner, and his only sibling had been systematically destroying everything they had built together while positioning Marcus to take responsibility for crimes he knew nothing about. The financial damage was extensive, but not irreparable. The FBI's investigation had frozen Daniel's offshore accounts before he could transfer all the stolen funds, recovering approximately 60% of the missing money. However, the emotional and reputational damage to Chen Technologies was potentially catastrophic. Several major clients had already begun questioning the stability of the company after rumors of the federal investigation began circulating within the healthcare technology community. Marcus had been forced to make an impossible choice between protecting his brother and saving his company. The FBI had made it clear that their investigation would continue regardless of his cooperation, but his willingness to assist could significantly impact both the recovery of stolen funds and the ultimate prosecution of the case. Agent Martinez had given him 48 hours to decide whether he would help them build a stronger case against Daniel by wearing a recording device during their next business meeting. The agents needed additional evidence of Daniel's ongoing fraud activities, and Marcus was the only person positioned to obtain that evidence without arousing suspicion. The decision had been agonizing, not because Marcus felt any loyalty to his brother after learning the truth, but because cooperating with federal agents felt like a fundamental betrayal of the family values their parents had instilled in them. David and Linda Chen had taught their sons that family meant sacrifice, protection, and unconditional support. Working with law enforcement to build a case against Daniel violated everything they had been taught about keeping family problems within the family. But Marcus had also realized that Daniel's actions represented a far deeper betrayal of those same family values. Their parents had worked themselves to exhaustion, building something meaningful for their sons, creating opportunities that neither David nor Linda had ever enjoyed themselves. Daniel's theft wasn't just a crime against the company, it was a desecration of their parents' sacrifice and dreams. The recording device Agent Martinez had given Marcus was smaller than a shirt button, designed to capture high-quality audio without detection. The technology was sophisticated enough to operate for 12 hours on a single charge while transmitting real-time audio to FBI monitoring equipment positioned nearby. Marcus had worn the device to his regular Monday morning meeting with Daniel, a routine review session they had maintained since taking over company operations after their father's heart attack. The routine had become comforting in its predictability, one of the few constants in a business environment that seemed to change daily. Daniel had arrived at the office that morning with his usual confidence, carrying coffee from their favorite downtown cafe and discussing potential new contracts with the casual enthusiasm that had once impressed Marcus as dedication to the company's growth. Now, knowing what he knew, Marcus could see the performance for what it was, a calculated deception designed to maintain his trust while concealing systematic theft. The conversation had begun with routine business matters, discussions of client implementation schedules, and pending contract negotiations that formed the normal substance of their weekly meetings.
But Marcus had gradually steered the discussion toward financial matters, expressing concern about cash flow issues that he claimed to have noticed in the company's monthly reports. Daniel's response had been masterful in its blend of concern and reassurance. He had acknowledged that some recent expenses had been higher than usual, but attributed this to necessary investments in business development and legal services required for their expansion into new markets. His explanation had been detailed and plausible, exactly the kind of response that had convinced Marcus to approve questionable expenses for months. But when Marcus had pressed for more specific information about particular vendors and service providers, Daniel's demeanor had shifted subtly. The casual confidence had been replaced by a more calculating tone as he explained why certain financial arrangements needed to remain confidential for competitive reasons. The incriminating moment had come when Marcus had specifically asked about Pacific NW Advisory, one of the shell companies the FBI had identified as a vehicle for Daniel's theft. Without hesitation, Daniel had launched into a detailed explanation of the consulting services this company was supposedly providing, describing specific deliverables and strategic recommendations that Marcus knew had never been produced. But more damning than the lies themselves was what Daniel had said next. Believing himself to be speaking confidentially to his trusting brother, he had admitted that some of these consulting arrangements were creative bookkeeping solutions designed to optimize their tax position and cash flow management. He had winked as he said this, inviting Marcus into what he presented as a harmless conspiracy to bend financial rules for the company's benefit. The FBI recording had captured Daniel explicitly acknowledging that Pacific NW Advisory was a fictional entity created to facilitate fund transfers that would be difficult to trace or reverse. He had described the arrangement as a little unconventional, but perfectly legal, positioning himself as a savvy businessman exploiting regulatory loopholes rather than a criminal stealing from his own family. When Marcus had expressed skepticism about the legal implications of these arrangements, Daniel had laughed and reminded him that their father had always been too conservative in his business practices, missing opportunities because of excessive caution about regulatory compliance. Daniel had positioned his theft as business innovation, a willingness to take calculated risks that their father's generation couldn't understand. The most devastating moment of the recorded conversation had come when Marcus had directly asked about their father's involvement in these financial decisions. Daniel had responded with casual cruelty that had shocked even the FBI agents monitoring the conversation. Daniel had explained that their father's current medical condition was actually a blessing in disguise because it allowed them to make necessary business decisions without having to navigate his old-fashioned concerns about every minor detail. He had described their father's unconscious state as providing operational flexibility that would help the company grow more aggressively. When Marcus had suggested that they should wait for their father's recovery before making major financial decisions, Daniel had laughed again and said that might not be necessary. He had implied that their father's cognitive capacity might never fully return, making it important for the next generation to take permanent control of company operations. The callousness of these statements had been difficult for Marcus to process even while they were being spoken. This was his brother discussing their father's medical crisis as a business opportunity, treating their parents' suffering as a convenient excuse for financial manipulation. But Daniel's most incriminating statement had come at the end of their recorded conversation. As Marcus had prepared to leave the meeting, Daniel had made an offhand comment about offshore investment strategies that would help them diversify beyond traditional domestic markets. He had mentioned specific amounts that corresponded exactly to the funds the FBI knew he had transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Daniel had been so confident in his deception that he had essentially confessed to the entire scheme while believing he was impressing his brother with sophisticated financial planning. The recording captured him describing money laundering activities as innovative investment strategies, presenting theft as business acumen. The FBI had been monitoring the conversation in real time from a surveillance van parked outside Chen Technologies' offices. Agent Martinez had later told Marcus that Daniel's admissions had provided enough evidence to secure federal indictments on multiple charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit theft. But the most personally devastating evidence had come from Daniel's casual comments about Marcus himself. Toward the end of their conversation, Daniel had made several statements that revealed his complete contempt for his older brother's trusting nature and technical focus.
Daniel had described Marcus as brilliant with code, but clueless about business, someone who could be easily manipulated because of his tendency to trust family members and avoid confrontation. He had laughed about how simple it had been to get Marcus to approve fraudulent expenses, describing his brother as the perfect fall guy because of his signature on all the relevant documents. The recording had captured Daniel explicitly stating that if their scheme was ever discovered, Marcus's documented approval of the fraudulent transactions would make him appear complicit in the theft. Daniel had positioned his brother not just as a victim of his fraud, but as an unknowing accomplice who could be sacrificed if legal problems arose. This calculated manipulation had perhaps been more hurtful than the financial theft itself. Marcus had realized that Daniel had never seen him as a partner or collaborator, but as a useful tool whose trust could be exploited and whose reputation could be destroyed if necessary to protect Daniel's interests. The FBI's investigation had continued for 3 more weeks after obtaining the recorded evidence, during which time Marcus had been forced to maintain normal business relations with Daniel while knowing the truth about his brother's betrayal. The psychological strain of this deception had been enormous, requiring him to act naturally during daily interactions with someone who had been systematically destroying his life. During this period, the FBI had worked to trace the complete scope of Daniel's financial crimes and identify all the offshore accounts containing stolen funds.
The investigation had revealed that Daniel's theft had been even more extensive than initially suspected, involving not just Chen Technologies, but also several other companies where Daniel had established fraudulent vendor relationships. The federal agents had also been building a comprehensive case that would ensure Daniel's conviction and maximize the recovery of stolen funds. This process had required extensive documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every false statement Daniel had made to financial institutions and government agencies. Marcus had been required to provide detailed testimony about his approval of various expenses and his understanding of the company's vendor relationships. This process had been emotionally difficult because it forced him to confront how his trusting nature had enabled Daniel's crimes, even though he bore no legal responsibility for his brother's actions. The most challenging aspect of cooperating with the FBI investigation had been maintaining secrecy from his parents, both of whom remained unaware of Daniel's betrayal. Their father was still recovering from his heart attack and multiple surgeries, while their mother had been focused entirely on supporting his rehabilitation. Marcus had been reluctant to add the stress of Daniel's criminal activity to their existing medical and emotional burdens. Agent Martinez had assured Marcus that his parents would eventually need to know the truth, both because of the legal proceedings that would follow Daniel's arrest and because of the elder abuse charges that directly involved their father's medical care. However, the agents had agreed to coordinate the disclosure with Marcus and their family's physician to minimize the psychological impact on David Chen's recovery. The investigation had also revealed the full extent of Daniel's manipulation of their father's medical treatment. The corrupt orderly who had been adjusting David Chen's medication schedule had been arrested separately and was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony had provided detailed evidence of how Daniel had orchestrated periods of heavy sedation to coincide with important business meetings and document signings. Medical records had confirmed that David Chen's pain medication levels had been systematically increased before visits from company attorneys, accountants, and business partners. During these artificially induced periods of unconsciousness, Daniel had forged his father's signature on documents authorizing wire transfers, account changes, and other financial transactions that a conscious David Chen would never have approved. The elder abuse charges were likely to result in additional prison time beyond the financial crimes, and they had transformed Daniel's theft from white-collar crime into something much more personal and cruel. The federal prosecutors had made it clear that they intended to pursue the maximum possible sentences for all charges, viewing Daniel's exploitation of his father's medical condition as particularly heinous. As the investigation had neared completion,
Marcus had been forced to begin preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Daniel and the complete destruction of their family relationships. The FBI had scheduled Daniel's arrest for a Tuesday morning, timing the action to occur at Chen Technologies' offices when Daniel would be present for their weekly staff meeting. The night before his brother's arrest, Marcus had sat in his downtown Seattle apartment, surrounded by family photographs and mementos from their shared childhood, trying to reconcile his memories of Daniel as a collaborator and friend with the evidence of his systematic betrayal. The cognitive dissonance had been overwhelming, forcing Marcus to question his judgment about everyone and everything he had trusted. He had spent hours reviewing the FBI's evidence files, studying the financial records and recorded conversations that documented his brother's crimes in excruciating detail. Each piece of evidence had reinforced the reality that Daniel's betrayal had been comprehensive and calculated, involving not just theft, but deliberate manipulation designed to destroy Marcus's reputation and potentially implicate him in crimes he knew nothing about. The hardest evidence to process had been Daniel's recorded statements about their father's medical condition and his casual cruelty toward their parents' sacrifice. Marcus had realized that his brother had become someone fundamentally different from the person he remembered, someone capable of exploiting family tragedy for personal gain without apparent remorse or hesitation. But perhaps most disturbing had been Daniel's apparent belief that his actions were justified by some perceived unfairness in their family dynamics or business relationship. The recorded conversations had revealed that Daniel harbored deep resentments about Marcus's role as the older brother and technical founder, viewing his own position as secondary and undervalued despite his equal ownership stake in the company. Daniel had expressed frustration that Marcus received more recognition for the company's technical innovations, despite Daniel's contributions to business development and client relationships. He had apparently convinced himself that stealing from the company was a form of compensation for this perceived inequity, rather than simple theft from his own family. These psychological insights had been almost more painful than the financial crimes themselves, because they revealed that Daniel's betrayal hadn't been motivated by external pressure or desperate circumstances, but by internal resentment and a sense of entitlement that had apparently been growing for years without Marcus's awareness. The arrest happened exactly as Agent Martinez had predicted. Daniel arrived at Chen Technologies that Tuesday morning carrying his usual oversized coffee and wearing the confident smile that had once reassured Marcus, but now felt like a mask hiding years of calculated deception. The FBI had positioned unmarked vehicles around the building's perimeter, while agents in business attire had already entered through the lobby, presenting themselves as potential clients meeting with the company's sales team. Marcus had been sitting in his office reviewing quarterly projections when he heard the commotion from the main conference room. Through his glass partition, he could see Daniel's expression transform from confusion to panic as Agent Martinez identified herself and began reading his rights. The federal agents had waited until Daniel was surrounded by colleagues and employees, ensuring that his arrest would be witnessed by the very people whose livelihoods he had been jeopardizing through his theft. The scene had unfolded with surreal precision. Daniel had initially attempted to maintain his composure, treating the arrest as some sort of misunderstanding that could be resolved through explanation and charm. He had looked directly at Marcus through the conference room glass, his expression conveying both desperation and expectation that his older brother would intervene on his behalf. But Marcus had remained seated at his desk, watching through the partition as federal agents handcuffed the man who had been systematically destroying everything their family had built. The other employees had stood frozen in shocked silence. As Daniel was escorted from the building, their trusted business development director revealed as a criminal who had been stealing from the company while planning to frame his own brother for the crimes.
The immediate aftermath of Daniel's arrest had been chaotic and emotionally devastating. Within hours, news of the federal investigation had spread throughout the Seattle technology community, prompting concerned calls from clients, vendors, and business partners who had heard rumors about criminal charges involving Chen Technologies' leadership. Marcus had spent the remainder of that day conducting damage control conversations with their largest clients, explaining the situation while trying to maintain confidence in the company's stability and integrity. Several healthcare systems had immediately expressed concerns about continuing their contracts with the company under federal investigation, regardless of which family member had actually committed the crimes. The local technology press had picked up the story by evening, publishing articles about the Chen Technologies scandal that painted both brothers as potentially culpable in a complex fraud scheme. The reporters had limited information about the specific charges, but the combination of federal arrest, family betrayal, and financial crimes had created exactly the kind of sensational narrative that attracted widespread attention. Marcus had been forced to hire a crisis management firm to handle media inquiries and protect the company's reputation while the legal proceedings unfolded. The consultants had advised him to maintain complete silence about the investigation while working behind the scenes to preserve client relationships and employee morale. The impact on Chen Technologies' workforce had been immediate and severe. Several key employees had submitted resignations within days of Daniel's arrest, citing concerns about the company's future stability and their own professional reputations. The departure of experienced staff members had created operational challenges that threatened to compound the financial damage Daniel's theft had already inflicted. Marcus had called an all-hands meeting 3 days after the arrest, gathering the remaining employees in their main conference room to address the situation as directly as possible without compromising the ongoing federal investigation. The gathering had been emotionally charged, with longtime employees expressing feelings of betrayal, confusion, and anger about having been unknowingly complicit in Daniel's fraud scheme. Many of the staff members had worked directly with Daniel on client relationships and business development initiatives, creating invoices and processing payments for the shell companies that had been stealing from Chen Technologies. These employees now faced the psychological burden of realizing they had been manipulated into facilitating crimes against their own employer. Marcus had struggled to find words that could adequately address the situation without revealing details that might compromise the federal case. He had assured the remaining staff that the company would survive the crisis and that none of them bore any responsibility for Daniel's criminal actions, but his reassurances had felt hollow even to himself. The financial implications of Daniel's arrest had extended far beyond the direct theft of company funds. Several major clients had initiated contract reviews that could result in the termination of relationships worth millions in annual revenue. The reputational damage was threatening to destroy business relationships that had taken years to develop and that represented the foundation of Chen Technologies' market position. Insurance claims related to the theft had become complicated by the fact that the perpetrator was a company owner and family member rather than an external criminal. The policies covering employee theft and corporate fraud contained exclusions that might prevent full recovery of the stolen funds, leaving Marcus personally liable for losses that could bankrupt both him and the company. The legal expenses associated with defending against potential civil lawsuits and cooperating with the federal investigation were mounting rapidly. Marcus had been forced to retain specialized attorneys who understood both white-collar criminal defense and corporate crisis management, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars in professional fees to the company's existing financial burdens. But perhaps most challenging had been the personal isolation that resulted from Daniel's arrest and the ongoing investigation. Marcus found himself unable to discuss the situation with friends or extended family members, both because of legal restrictions and because the betrayal felt too personal and humiliating to share with people who had known both brothers for years. The FBI investigation had continued even after Daniel's arrest, as FBI agents worked to trace the complete network of shell companies and offshore accounts he had created. Agent Martinez had explained that Daniel's operation had been more sophisticated than initially suspected, involving partnerships with other criminals who specialize in money laundering and corporate fraud.
During the weeks following the arrest, Marcus had been required to provide additional testimony and documentation to support the federal case. This process had involved reviewing thousands of emails, financial records, and business documents that chronicled Daniel's systematic deception over the course of nearly 2 years. Each piece of evidence had revealed new layers of betrayal and manipulation. Marcus discovered that Daniel had been intercepting communications between the company and its accountants, altering financial reports before they reached Marcus for review. He had been scheduling important business meetings during times when Marcus was traveling or attending technical conferences, ensuring that critical decisions were made without his older brother's input or oversight. The investigation had also revealed that Daniel had been actively recruiting accomplices within Chen Technologies, cultivating relationships with employees who might be willing to assist his fraud scheme in exchange for promised promotions or financial incentives. Several staff members had been unknowingly manipulated into providing information or access that facilitated Daniel's theft, while others had been approached directly about participating in what Daniel had described as creative accounting solutions. Most disturbing had been the discovery that Daniel had been planning to expand his operations significantly. The FBI had found evidence that he intended to replicate his Chen Technologies scheme at other family-owned technology companies throughout the Pacific Northwest, using the expertise and contacts he had developed to systematically defraud multiple businesses. Daniel's offshore network had been designed to accommodate much larger volumes of stolen funds, suggesting that his ultimate goal had been to establish a permanent criminal enterprise, rather than simply stealing from his own family's company. The scope of his ambitions had shocked even the federal agents investigating the case, who described it as one of the most sophisticated family business fraud schemes they had encountered.
Daniel had been living a double life that included romantic relationships with women who believed he was a successful entrepreneur building a technology empire. He had been using stolen money to fund an elaborate deception that extended far beyond his immediate family, creating false identities and fictional business ventures to impress potential romantic partners and social contacts. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted Daniel as someone who had developed an increasingly grandiose sense of entitlement and self-importance. FBI behavioral analysts had suggested that his criminal activities were motivated not just by greed, but by a narcissistic need to prove his superiority over his older brother and parents. Daniel had apparently convinced himself that his theft was justified because he deserved a larger share of the family business success. He had expressed resentment about Marcus receiving recognition for technical innovations, while feeling that his own contributions to business development were undervalued and unappreciated. The federal prosecutors had been building their case methodically, gathering evidence that would ensure Daniel's conviction on multiple felony charges. The recorded conversations Marcus had helped obtain were considered crucial evidence, but they represented only a small portion of the documentation that would be presented at trial. Daniel's attorney had initially attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would have resulted in reduced charges in exchange for cooperation in recovering stolen funds and identifying other potential victims of similar schemes. However, the prosecutors had rejected these overtures because of the severity of the elder abuse charges and the sophisticated nature of the financial crimes. The elder abuse aspect of the case had attracted significant attention from advocacy groups and legal organizations focused on protecting vulnerable adults from family exploitation. Daniel's manipulation of his father's medical treatment had been characterized as particularly egregious because it involved exploiting a medical crisis for financial gain. Medical experts had testified that the additional sedation Daniel had arranged could have significantly compromised his father's recovery from cardiac surgery. The unauthorized medication adjustments had potentially delayed David Chen's rehabilitation and extended his hospitalization, creating additional health risks that could have had permanent consequences. The corrupt medical orderly, who had facilitated Daniel's abuse of their father, had provided detailed testimony about the systematic nature of the medication manipulation. His cooperation with federal investigators had revealed that Daniel had researched drug interactions and timing to maximize the periods when David Chen would be unconscious and unable to participate in business decisions.
This evidence had transformed the case from financial fraud into something much more personal and cruel. The prosecutors had made it clear that they viewed Daniel's exploitation of his father's medical vulnerability as evidence of a complete lack of empathy or moral restraint that justified the maximum possible criminal penalties. The impact on David Chen's recovery had been both physical and psychological. When he had finally been informed about Daniel's arrest and the charges against him, the shock had caused a temporary setback in his cardiac rehabilitation. His physicians had been concerned that the emotional stress might trigger another heart attack or other serious medical complications. Linda Chen had been equally devastated by the revelation of her younger son's criminal activities. She had spent weeks refusing to believe that Daniel could be capable of such systematic betrayal, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding or external pressure that had forced him to act against his family's interests. The family sessions with FBI victim advocates had been emotionally wrenching experiences that forced all three remaining family members to confront the reality of Daniel's calculated cruelty. The agents had been trained to help families cope with betrayal by trusted relatives, but the combination of financial fraud and elder abuse had created an unusually complex trauma that required specialized counseling support. Marcus had found himself in the impossible position of trying to support his parents' emotional recovery while simultaneously managing the crisis at Chen Technologies and cooperating with the ongoing federal investigation. The multiple responsibilities had been overwhelming, requiring him to compartmentalize his own grief and anger while focusing on practical matters that could determine both his family's future and the survival of their business. The media attention surrounding the case had been particularly difficult for his parents to endure. Local news outlets had featured stories about the Chen family betrayal that included photographs of Daniel being arrested and speculation about the motivations behind his crimes. The public nature of their private tragedy had added humiliation to their existing emotional trauma. Community members who had known the family for decades had been shocked by revelations about Daniel's criminal activities. The Chen family had been well regarded within Seattle's Asian American business community, known for their work ethic, charitable contributions, and commitment to supporting other immigrant entrepreneurs. Daniel's crimes had not only damaged his immediate family, but had also reflected poorly on the broader community that had celebrated Chen Technologies as an example of immigrant success and innovation. Several community leaders had expressed concern that the scandal might reinforce negative stereotypes about family-owned businesses or Asian American entrepreneurs. The financial recovery process had been complicated by the international nature of Daniel's money laundering operation. Federal agents had been working with law enforcement agencies in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore to freeze accounts containing stolen funds. But the repatriation of those assets involved complex legal procedures that could take months or years to complete. Asset forfeiture proceedings have been initiated against Daniel's personal property, including his downtown condominium, luxury vehicles, and expensive artwork purchased with stolen money. However, the value of these assets represented only a fraction of the total amount he had stolen from Chen Technologies over the course of his fraud scheme. The company's insurance coverage had provided some protection against the financial losses, but the policies contained numerous exclusions and limitations that reduced the actual recovery significantly below the face value of the coverage. The insurance companies had also launched their own investigations to determine whether Marcus had any knowledge or responsibility for his brother's criminal activities. These parallel investigations had created additional stress and legal expenses for Marcus, who had been required to provide extensive documentation and testimony to multiple insurance companies while the federal criminal case was still pending.
The insurance adjusters had been skeptical of his claims of complete ignorance about Daniel's fraud, viewing his position as company co-owner as inherently suspicious. The process of rebuilding Chen Technologies had required Marcus to essentially start over with many aspects of the business operation. Daniel's shell companies had been so thoroughly integrated into the company's vendor network that identifying legitimate business relationships from fraudulent ones had become a massive undertaking, requiring forensic accounting expertise. Marcus had been forced to audit every vendor relationship, every contract, and every financial transaction from the previous 2 years to determine which business arrangements were genuine and which had been created by Daniel to facilitate his theft.
This process had revealed that approximately 30% of the company's recent expenses had been fraudulent, representing money that had been stolen rather than invested in legitimate business development. The vendor audit had also revealed that Daniel had been sabotaging relationships with legitimate service providers while favoring his fraudulent companies. He had been deliberately creating conflicts with honest vendors to justify switching to his shell companies, ensuring that increasing amounts of company money flowed through accounts he controlled. Some of the legitimate vendors who had been terminated or marginalized by Daniel had been willing to resume their relationships with Chen Technologies once they understood the circumstances. However, others had been so offended by their treatment that they refused to consider working with the company again, regardless of which family member had been responsible for the problems. The client retention efforts had been similarly challenging and emotionally draining. Marcus had been required to personally meet with representatives from each major client to explain the situation and provide assurances about the company's future stability and integrity. These conversations had been humiliating experiences that forced him to acknowledge his own failure to detect his brother's criminal activities. Several clients had been surprisingly understanding and supportive, recognizing that Marcus had been as much a victim of Daniel's crimes as they had been. These relationships had provided crucial stability during the crisis and had given Marcus hope that Chen Technologies could eventually recover from the scandal. However, other clients had been unwilling to continue working with the company that had been so thoroughly compromised by internal fraud. The termination of these contracts had eliminated millions of dollars in annual revenue and had forced Marcus to implement significant cost-cutting measures, including employee layoffs and facility downsizing. The psychological impact of making these business decisions had been compounded by Marcus's awareness that the problems were entirely the result of his brother's criminal actions, rather than normal market forces or competitive pressures. Every employee who lost their job and every contract that was canceled represented a direct consequence of Daniel's betrayal of the family and the business. The federal trial preparation had consumed an enormous amount of Marcus's time and emotional energy. As the primary witness against his brother, he had been required to review thousands of pages of evidence and prepare for intensive cross-examination by Daniel's defense attorneys, who would likely attempt to shift blame and responsibility to Marcus himself. The prospect of testifying against his own brother in federal court had been emotionally devastating for Marcus to contemplate. Despite everything Daniel had done, the idea of contributing to his imprisonment felt like a fundamental violation of the family loyalty their parents had taught them to value above all else. But Marcus had also realized that allowing Daniel to escape consequences for his crimes would represent an even greater betrayal of their parents' values and sacrifices. David and Linda Chen had built their lives around principles of honesty, hard work, and responsibility. Protecting Daniel from accountability would dishonor everything they had tried to teach their sons about integrity and moral courage. The federal prosecutors had been preparing for a trial that would likely last several weeks and would involve complex financial evidence that could be difficult for a jury to understand. They had been working with expert witnesses who could explain the technical aspects of Daniel's money laundering operation and the sophisticated methods he had used to hide his criminal activities. Daniel's defense strategy had apparently focused on portraying his crimes as the result of psychological problems or external pressures rather than deliberate criminal intent. His attorneys had been exploring potential mental health defenses and had been gathering evidence about stress and family dynamics that might mitigate his culpability. However, the recorded conversations Marcus had helped obtain had made it extremely difficult for Daniel's defense team to argue that his crimes were the result of diminished capacity or external coercion. The recordings clearly demonstrated that Daniel had been fully aware of the illegal nature of his activities and had been planning them carefully over an extended period. The elder abuse charges had been particularly damaging to any potential defense strategy because they demonstrated a level of cruelty and calculation that contradicted claims of mental illness or emotional disturbance. The systematic nature of Daniel's manipulation of his father's medical treatment suggested a cold-blooded willingness to cause harm that would be difficult to explain or justify to a jury. As the trial date approached, Marcus had been forced to confront the reality that his relationship with Daniel was permanently destroyed and that their family would never recover from the trauma of his betrayal. The brother he had trusted and collaborated with for decades had revealed himself to be someone fundamentally different from the person Marcus had believed him to be. The process of accepting this reality had been one of the most difficult challenges Marcus had ever faced, requiring him to rebuild his understanding of his own judgment, his family relationships, and his ability to trust others in both personal and professional contexts. The betrayal had shaken his confidence in his ability to read people and situations accurately, creating anxiety about future business relationships and partnerships. But the crisis had also revealed strength and resilience that Marcus hadn't known he possessed. The process of saving Chen Technologies from destruction had required him to develop new skills in crisis management, media relations, and stakeholder communication that had ultimately made him a more capable and confident business leader. The support he had received from employees who remained loyal to the company had been both surprising and deeply meaningful. These individuals had chosen to stay with Chen Technologies despite the uncertainty and reputational risks, demonstrating a level of commitment to the company's mission and values that had helped sustain Marcus through the darkest periods of the crisis.
The experience had also deepened his appreciation for his parents' strength and character. Watching David and Linda Chen cope with the trauma of their younger son's betrayal while supporting the recovery of their family business had reminded Marcus of the resilience and determination that had enabled them to build successful lives in America, despite facing significant cultural and economic challenges as immigrants. Their response to Daniel's crimes had been characterized by profound sadness rather than anger, a grief for the loss of the son they thought they knew, rather than rage about the financial damage he had caused. This emotional maturity had provided a model for Marcus as he struggled to process his own feelings about his brother's betrayal. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle stood imposing against the gray Pacific Northwest sky as Marcus Chen walked through its security checkpoints for what would be the final confrontation with his brother. 6 months had passed since Daniel's arrest, and the trial was finally beginning after extensive plea negotiations had failed to produce an agreement acceptable to federal prosecutors. The weight of carrying a recording device during those crucial conversations with Daniel had prepared Marcus for this moment, but facing his brother across a courtroom still felt surreal and emotionally devastating. Daniel appeared in court wearing an expensive suit that Marcus recognized as having been purchased with stolen money from Chen Technologies. His younger brother's confident demeanor had been replaced by a subdued anxiety that suggested his attorneys had been realistic about the strength of the federal case against him. The recorded conversations Marcus had helped obtain were scheduled to be played for the jury during the prosecution's opening arguments, ensuring that Daniel's own words would establish both his guilt and his complete lack of remorse for the crimes he had committed. The jury selection process had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for their attitudes toward white-collar crime, family businesses, and elder abuse. The prosecutors had been particularly concerned about finding jurors who could understand the technical aspects of Daniel's money laundering scheme, while also grasping the emotional significance of his betrayal of family trust and exploitation of their father's medical vulnerability. Daniel's defense team had attempted to exclude jurors with backgrounds in technology or finance, arguing that such individuals might be prejudiced against sophisticated fraud schemes. However, the judge had ruled that the technical nature of the case required jurors with sufficient education and experience to understand complex financial evidence, limiting the defense's ability to select a jury that might be sympathetic to claims of confusion or misunderstanding. The prosecution's opening statement had been delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Torres, a veteran prosecutor specializing in white-collar crimes who had built her career on complex fraud cases involving family businesses and elder abuse. Her presentation had been methodical and devastating, walking the jury through Daniel's crimes chronologically while emphasizing the personal betrayal and calculated cruelty that distinguish this case from typical corporate fraud.
Torres had begun by playing excerpts from the FBI recordings that captured Daniel discussing his theft with casual confidence, while describing his unconscious father as a business opportunity rather than a family member deserving care and protection. The audio quality had been excellent, ensuring that every juror could hear Daniel's voice clearly as he explained how he was manipulating medication schedules to facilitate document forgery and unauthorized financial transactions. The prosecutor had also introduced evidence showing the sophisticated nature of Daniel's shell company network, demonstrating that his crimes required extensive planning and preparation rather than impulsive decisions made under pressure. Financial charts and organizational diagrams had illustrated how Daniel had created an elaborate infrastructure for theft that was designed to operate for years while implicating Marcus as an unwitting accomplice. The elder abuse evidence had been particularly compelling for the jury, with medical experts testifying about the potential health consequences of Daniel's manipulation of their father's medication regimen. A cardiac rehabilitation specialist had explained that the unauthorized sedation could have significantly delayed David Chen's recovery and might have contributed to complications that extended his hospitalization. The corrupt medical orderly who had facilitated Daniel's abuse of their father had testified under a cooperation agreement, providing detailed evidence about the systematic nature of the medication manipulation. His testimony had revealed that Daniel had researched drug interactions and timing to maximize periods when David Chen would be unconscious during crucial business meetings and document signings. Marcus had been called as the prosecution's primary witness on the fourth day of trial, a moment he had been dreading since agreeing to cooperate with the FBI investigation. Walking to the witness stand while Daniel watched from the defense table had been one of the most difficult experiences of his life, representing the final destruction of their relationship and the complete betrayal of the family loyalty their parents had taught them to value. The direct examination had been conducted by Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres, who had guided Marcus through his testimony with professional competence while remaining sensitive to the emotional difficulty of his position. The questions had been designed to establish Marcus's credibility while demonstrating his complete ignorance of Daniel's criminal activities until the FBI investigation revealed the truth. Marcus had testified about the founding of Chen Technologies and the equal partnership he had believed existed between himself and Daniel throughout their business relationship. He had described his trust in Daniel's handling of vendor relationships and business development, explaining how this trust had been systematically exploited to facilitate theft from their own company. The most emotionally challenging portion of his testimony had involved playing the complete FBI recordings for the jury, requiring Marcus to listen again to Daniel's casual discussion of theft and elder abuse while sitting just feet away from his brother. The recordings had been devastating evidence that demonstrated not only Daniel's guilt, but also his complete lack of remorse or concern for the impact of his crimes on their family. Marcus had also been required to testify about discovering the theft through real-time monitoring of company accounts, describing the shock and disbelief he had experienced while watching millions of dollars disappear through unauthorized transactions. His testimony had emphasized that he had immediately contacted law enforcement upon discovering the theft, contradicting any suggestion that he had been complicit in his brother's crimes. The cross-examination by Daniel's defense attorney had been aggressive and emotionally brutal, attempting to portray Marcus as a controlling older brother who had marginalized Daniel's contributions to the company while taking credit for their shared success. The defense strategy had been to suggest that Daniel's crimes were motivated by legitimate grievances about unfair treatment rather than simple greed or malice. Defense attorney Mitchell Brennan had questioned Marcus extensively about the division of responsibilities within Chen Technologies, suggesting that Daniel had been excluded from important technical decisions while being held responsible for generating revenue through business development activities.
The attorney had attempted to portray the company's structure as inherently unfair to Daniel, creating pressure that might explain his criminal behavior. However, Marcus had been well prepared for these attacks by the federal prosecutors, who had anticipated that the defense would attempt to shift blame and create sympathy for Daniel by portraying him as a victim of family dynamics. Marcus had calmly explained that Daniel had been an equal partner with identical ownership stakes and compensation, contradicting suggestions that he had been treated unfairly. The cross-examination had also focused on Marcus's approval of fraudulent expenses, with the defense attorney suggesting that a competent business owner should have detected the sophisticated fraud scheme Daniel had been operating. Brennan had attempted to argue that Marcus's failure to identify the theft demonstrated either incompetence or willful blindness that might indicate complicity. But Marcus had effectively countered these suggestions by explaining the sophisticated nature of Daniel's deception and the reasonable business justifications he had provided for questionable expenses. The federal prosecutors had introduced evidence showing that Daniel's shell companies had been professionally designed to appear legitimate, with fake websites, letterhead, and employee directories that would have passed casual inspection. The testimony of other Chen Technologies employees had reinforced Marcus's credibility while demonstrating how Daniel had manipulated multiple people to facilitate his fraud scheme. Operations manager Jennifer Walsh had testified about being asked to process invoices for companies she had never heard of, but that Daniel had assured her were legitimate business partners providing essential services. Chief financial consultant Harold Kim had described how Daniel had intercepted communications with the company's external accountants, providing false information about vendor relationships and business expenses that had prevented detection of the fraud during quarterly reviews. His testimony had shown that Daniel's deception had been systematic and comprehensive, involving multiple layers of false documentation and misdirection. The prosecution had also called former Chen Technologies employees who had been recruited by Daniel to participate in what he had described as creative accounting solutions, designed to optimize the company's tax position. These witnesses had testified that Daniel had presented his schemes as legal business strategies rather than criminal activities, demonstrating his ability to manipulate people through false explanations and professional presentations. Computer forensics expert Dr. Sarah Martinez had provided technical testimony about the digital evidence recovered from Daniel's personal devices and offshore accounts. Her analysis had revealed the complete scope of Daniel's money laundering operation, including communications with known criminals who specialized in corporate fraud and international financial crimes. The forensics evidence had shown that Daniel had been planning to expand his operations significantly, targeting other family-owned technology companies throughout the Pacific Northwest, using the expertise and criminal contacts he had developed through his theft from Chen Technologies. His criminal ambitions had extended far beyond stealing from his own family, revealing plans for a permanent criminal enterprise. FBI Special Agent Rodriguez had testified about the investigation process and the sophisticated techniques required to trace Daniel's offshore financial network. His testimony had emphasized the international scope of Daniel's money laundering operation and the criminal expertise required to establish the complex web of shell companies and foreign accounts. The agent had also described Daniel's cooperation with other criminals involved in corporate fraud schemes, providing evidence that his crimes against Chen Technologies were part of a broader pattern of criminal activity that extended beyond family betrayal into organized financial crime. Medical expert Dr. Patricia Chen had provided devastating testimony about the elder abuse aspects of the case, explaining how Daniel's manipulation of their father's medication could have caused serious health complications. Her testimony had been particularly effective because she shared the same surname as the family, creating an emotional connection that emphasized the cultural significance of filial responsibility within Asian American communities. The doctor had explained that unauthorized medication adjustments in cardiac patients could cause dangerous fluctuations in blood pressure and heart rhythm that might trigger additional heart attacks or strokes. Her testimony had demonstrated that Daniel's abuse of their father had created genuine medical risks that went far beyond the financial crimes. Child and elder abuse counselor Maria Gonzalez had testified about the psychological impact of family betrayal on vulnerable adults, explaining how David Chen's trust in his son had been exploited to facilitate crimes that threatened both his financial security and physical health. Her testimony had provided context for understanding the emotional trauma inflicted on the entire Chen family through Daniel's systematic deception. The financial evidence presented by forensic accountant Robert Chang had been comprehensive and damning, documenting every fraudulent transaction and unauthorized transfer that Daniel had conducted over the course of his criminal scheme. His analysis had shown that Daniel had stolen approximately $2.7 million from Chen Technologies while creating false documentation that would have implicated Marcus if the scheme had been discovered later. Chang's testimony had also revealed that Daniel's theft had been accelerating in the months before his arrest, suggesting that he was preparing to implement the final phase of his plan to bankrupt Chen Technologies while positioning himself to acquire the company's assets through his shell companies. The defense case had been brief and largely ineffective, relying primarily on character witnesses who testified about Daniel's positive qualities and community involvement prior to his criminal activities. Several former colleagues and college friends had described Daniel as intelligent and charismatic, but their testimony had been undermined by the overwhelming evidence of his systematic deception and cruelty. Daniel's former girlfriend, Rachel Morrison, had testified about his generous and caring behavior during their relationship, but her testimony had been severely damaged during cross-examination when prosecutors revealed that Daniel had been funding their expensive lifestyle with money stolen from his family's business. A psychological expert hired by the defense had attempted to explain Daniel's crimes as the result of competitive pressure and feelings of inadequacy related to his relationship with Marcus. Dr. Stephen Phillips had suggested that Daniel's criminal behavior stemmed from psychological issues rather than inherent criminality. But his testimony had been unconvincing given the sophisticated planning and international scope of Daniel's fraud scheme. The prosecution had effectively countered the psychological defense by emphasizing the calculated nature of Daniel's crimes and his complete lack of remorse or concern for his victims. The FBI recordings had captured Daniel expressing satisfaction about his successful manipulation of his family, rather than guilt or regret about the harm he was causing. Daniel's decision not to testify on his own behalf had been strategically sound given the strength of the recorded evidence against him, but it had left the jury without any explanation or expression of remorse that might have mitigated his culpability. His silence in the face of overwhelming evidence had reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as an unrepentant criminal who felt entitled to steal from his own family.
The closing arguments had been emotionally powerful presentations that crystallized the evidence and themes developed throughout the trial. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres had delivered a methodical summation that emphasized the betrayal of family trust while highlighting the sophisticated criminal enterprise Daniel had created to steal from Chen Technologies. The prosecutor had played key excerpts from the FBI recordings one final time, ensuring that the jury's final impression would be Daniel's own voice describing his crimes with casual confidence while showing complete disregard for his family's welfare. The audio evidence had been the most compelling proof of Daniel's guilt and had eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or good intentions. Torres had also emphasized the elder abuse aspects of the case, arguing that Daniel's exploitation of their father's medical vulnerability represented a particularly cruel form of betrayal that justified the maximum possible criminal penalties. The systematic nature of the medication manipulation had demonstrated Daniel's willingness to risk his father's health for financial gain. Defense attorney Brennan had attempted to humanize Daniel while minimizing the severity of his crimes, arguing that family dynamics and business pressures had created circumstances that explained his poor decisions. However, his arguments had been undermined by the evidence of careful planning and international criminal coordination that contradicted any suggestion of impulsive or emotion-driven behavior. The jury deliberation had lasted only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges. The speed of their decision had reflected the overwhelming strength of the recorded evidence and the systematic documentation of Daniel's criminal activities.
Daniel's reaction to the verdict had been one of shocked disbelief, as if he had somehow expected to avoid consequences despite the compelling evidence against him. His attorneys had immediately indicated their intention to appeal, but legal experts had suggested that the recorded confessions made successful appeal extremely unlikely. The sentencing phase had been scheduled for 8 weeks after the conviction, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements from Marcus, his parents, and affected Chen Technologies employees. The federal sentencing guidelines had suggested a prison term of 12 to 15 years based on the amount of money stolen and the aggravating factors of elder abuse and sophisticated criminal planning. Marcus had struggled with the decision of whether to provide a victim impact statement that might influence Daniel's sentence. Part of him had wanted to express the complete devastation Daniel's crimes had caused for their family and business, while another part had been reluctant to contribute further to his brother's punishment despite the magnitude of his betrayal. His parents had been equally conflicted about the sentencing process, torn between their anger about Daniel's crimes and their natural instinct to protect their son from additional suffering. David Chen's recovery had progressed steadily, but the emotional trauma of Daniel's betrayal had created lasting psychological scars that had complicated his physical rehabilitation. Linda Chen had been perhaps the most devastated by Daniel's conviction, struggling to reconcile her memories of the caring son she had raised with the evidence of his systematic cruelty toward his own family. The trial had forced her to confront the reality that Daniel had been planning his crimes for years while maintaining normal family relationships. The process of rebuilding Chen Technologies had continued throughout the trial, with Marcus working to restore client confidence while implementing new financial controls designed to prevent future fraud. The company had survived the crisis but remained significantly smaller than before Daniel's theft, having lost several major contracts and experienced substantial employee turnover. The recovery of stolen funds had been partially successful, with federal asset forfeiture proceedings returning approximately 60% of the money Daniel had taken from the company. However, the legal expenses and lost business opportunities had created additional financial damage that would take years to overcome completely. Marcus had been forced to sell the company's secondary office building and reduce staff levels to maintain financial stability during the recovery period. These decisions had been emotionally difficult because they represented tangible consequences of Daniel's crimes that affected innocent employees and their families. Several former Chen Technologies employees had found new positions with competing companies, taking with them relationships and expertise that had been valuable assets for the business. The brain drain had created operational challenges that had required Marcus to rebuild institutional knowledge and client relationships from scratch. However, the crisis had also revealed strengths within the organization that had provided hope for the future. The employees who had remained loyal to Chen Technologies had demonstrated exceptional commitment and resilience, working longer hours and taking on additional responsibilities to help the company survive its worst period. Client relationships that had survived the scandal had actually become stronger as a result of Marcus's transparency and accountability during the crisis. Several healthcare systems had expressed appreciation for his honest communication about the situation and his efforts to protect their interests, despite the internal chaos caused by Daniel's crimes. The media attention surrounding the trial had generally been favorable to Marcus and sympathetic to the family's victimization by Daniel's crimes. Local business publications had featured stories about Chen Technologies' recovery efforts and Marcus's leadership during the crisis, helping to rebuild the company's reputation within the technology community. The sentencing hearing had been attended by dozens of supporters, including Chen Technologies employees, clients, and community leaders, who had come to demonstrate their respect for Marcus and his parents. Their presence had provided emotional support while also showing the judge the broader impact of Daniel's crimes on people beyond his immediate family. Marcus had ultimately decided to provide a victim impact statement that focused on the damage to their family relationships and the betrayal of their parents' values, rather than requesting maximum punishment for Daniel.
His statement had been emotional but measured, expressing grief about the loss of his brother while acknowledging the necessity of accountability for serious crimes. David Chen had also provided a brief statement with assistance from a translator, describing his shock and sadness about Daniel's betrayal while emphasizing his continued love for both sons despite the circumstances.
His statement had been particularly powerful because it demonstrated the dignity and forgiveness that had characterized his response throughout the crisis. Linda Chen had been too emotional to provide a formal statement, but her presence in the courtroom had conveyed the depth of her pain and the family's commitment to supporting the legal process despite their personal anguish. Judge Patricia Williams had imposed a sentence of 14 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, citing the sophisticated nature of Daniel's crimes and the aggravating factor of elder abuse as justification for a lengthy incarceration period. The judge had also ordered complete restitution for all stolen funds plus interest and penalties. Daniel's reaction to the sentence had been one of stunned silence, finally seeming to understand the magnitude of consequences he would face for his systematic betrayal of his family's trust. His attorneys had immediately filed notice of appeal, but legal experts had been unanimous in their assessment that the conviction and sentence were unlikely to be overturned given the strength of the recorded evidence. The conclusion of the legal proceedings had provided some closure for Marcus and his parents, but the emotional healing process would clearly take much longer than the criminal justice system's resolution of Daniel's crimes. The family had begun working with counselors who specialized in helping victims of financial crimes and family betrayal to develop strategies for moving forward. Chen Technologies had stabilized financially and operationally by the time of Daniel's sentencing, having rebuilt its client base and employee roster while implementing comprehensive internal controls designed to prevent future fraud. The company had emerged from the crisis smaller but more resilient, with a stronger corporate culture and more sophisticated risk management procedures. Marcus had been recognized by several industry organizations for his leadership during the crisis and his commitment to protecting client interests, despite the personal and financial cost of Daniel's crimes. These honors had helped restore his professional reputation while providing validation for the difficult decisions he had made throughout the recovery process. The experience had fundamentally changed Marcus's approach to business relationships and family dynamics, making him more cautious about trusting others, while also deepening his appreciation for the employees and clients who had remained loyal during the company's darkest period. He had learned to balance healthy skepticism with the openness necessary for building meaningful professional partnerships. His relationship with his parents had actually grown stronger as a result of surviving Daniel's betrayal together, with shared trauma creating deeper bonds of trust and mutual support. The crisis had forced all 3 surviving family members to rely on each other in ways that had revealed previously unrecognized strengths and resilience. David Chen's recovery had continued steadily, with his cardiologist expressing optimism about his long-term prognosis, despite the complications created by Daniel's interference with his medical treatment. The elder Chen had returned to limited involvement with company operations, providing advisory support while Marcus maintained primary operational responsibility. Linda Chen had struggled more with the psychological aftermath of Daniel's crimes, requiring ongoing counseling to process her grief about losing the son she thought she knew. However, she had gradually developed a new sense of pride in Marcus's leadership and resilience that had helped her find meaning in the family's survival of the crisis. The broader Asian American business community in Seattle had rallied around the Chen family during their recovery, providing both practical support and emotional encouragement that had helped them maintain their cultural connections despite the shame and embarrassment of Daniel's public crimes. Several other family-owned businesses had implemented new internal controls based on lessons learned from Chen Technologies' experience, treating Daniel's fraud as a cautionary tale about the importance of checks and balances even within trusted family relationships. Marcus had begun speaking at business conferences and family enterprise seminars about fraud prevention and crisis management, sharing his experience to help other entrepreneurs protect themselves from similar betrayals. These speaking engagements had been emotionally difficult but professionally rewarding, allowing him to transform his trauma into useful guidance for others. The long-term impact of Daniel's crimes would continue to influence Chen Technologies' operations and family relationships for years to come. But the successful prosecution and recovery efforts had demonstrated that even the most devastating betrayals could be survived through determination, integrity, and community support.
As Marcus reflected on the 18 months that had passed since discovering Daniel's theft, he recognized that the crisis had ultimately strengthened both his family and his business in unexpected ways. The experience had been traumatic and costly, but it had also revealed resources of character and resilience that would serve them well in facing future challenges. The federal prison sentence ensured that Daniel would have years to reflect on the consequences of his choices, while the family he had betrayed continued building the legacy their parents had dreamed of creating in America. Justice had been served, restitution had been ordered, and Chen Technologies had survived to honor the values of honesty and hard work that had always defined the Chen family's approach to business and life.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.